a psilocybin journey would likely impact your menstrual cycle, and vice versa, that the menstrual cycle may impact your journey, depending on where you are in your cycle.
Hi, I'm Shannon. Thanks for tuning into Power Perspectives. So for International Women's Day, I am super stoked to introduce my incredible guest. She is an award-winning freelance science and medical journalist, author of the Psilocybin Handbook for Women, speaker, teacher, editor, and writer for large publications such as The Washington Post, Healthline, and Better Homes and Gardens. She also fits in being the managing editor at the revered magazine Shift. And on top of this, you can find her conducting workshops, talks, Q&As all over the US. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome Jennifer Chesak to Power Perspectives. Welcome, Jennifer.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm so glad to be here.
It's an absolute pleasure. Did you think all those years back when you're studying your master's degree in journalism from Northwestern University that you would be the proud author of a psilocybin handbook for women? Was that in the cards?
I never could have imagined that in my wildest dreams. Of course, I always had a goal to write a book, but I never knew what the right topic would be. And this just turned out to be the right topic at the right time. But if you had asked me back then when I was in graduate school if this would be the topic, I never would have thought that, just because we didn't have all this new research coming out about psychedelics and their therapeutic potential. And there was a lot of stigma surrounding psychedelics related to the war on drugs. And so I couldn't have imagined writing about that at that time, even though I appreciated psychedelics for various reasons. So yeah, but this is a wild ride. It's great. I'm happy to be here.
That's absolutely brilliant. You cover such a vast topics in your book, all related to women and all related to not just microdosing, but macrodosing and your experience of psychedelics. My friend, he's got this incredible company, and he knows it's Mindful Meds, shameful plug there, but 90% of his clientele are women. Can you share with us why you think more females turn to psychedelic treatment than males?
Yeah, absolutely. That is such a great question. One of the big reasons that this book exists. So, yes, in many cases, more women are turning to psychedelics than men. And that statistic comes from the Global Drug Survey of 2020. And it turns out there's probably a little bit of a difference in the way that men and women use psychedelics. And this also comes from this survey. And that is that men tend to use psychedelics a little bit more recreationally. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm not disparaging recreational use. However, women are typically turning to psychedelics to self-treat. And they're turning to psychedelics to self-treat for conditions like PTSD, other forms of trauma, anxiety, depression, chronic pain, and then issues related to their menstrual cycles. And these are obviously very, very much conditions that disproportionately affect the female body, and also where women go to their doctor to receive treatment for some of these conditions, and they aren't getting adequate treatment in the mainstream medical system. And they're gaslit for these very things. For example, I have endometriosis, a condition that affects 1 in 10 people assigned female at birth. And I've been, in and out of the doctor's office so many times, and I can't even believe what some doctors have said to me, including that it's all in my head when I have, irrefutable proof. Yeah, I'm serious. That I have endometriosis. I have surgical proof, And so women are turning to psychedelics to self-treat, and again, because they're not getting adequate care in the mainstream medical system. And so I just really wanted to put a book out there that has adequate and good information, safety information, and all the context of the female body and how psilocybin sort of intersects with women's health, and to kind of further illustrate that thing that I said about the mainstream medical system. I'm not against the mainstream medical system. I'm a science and medical journalist, as you well know, but I do like to illustrate some disparities here. And I always like to throw out this timeline to really illustrate this. And that is that women were largely excluded from early stage clinical trials until about 1993. And, that really wasn't that long ago, if you think about it. And that's had some pretty dramatic ramifications for women's health. So in 1998, men got a drug for male sexual dysfunction, and everyone knows what that is. It's Viagra. It's a household name. And at that point in time, the mainstream medical system, let alone anyone that a woman might have been sleeping with, didn't have an adequate picture of what the clitoris looks like. There's all this internal structure to it, and which is really important for female sexual function. And that didn't occur until 2005 when a female urologist did this research to discover this. And then if you think about that, I mean, again, that's not really that long ago, 2005. And then fast forward to 2015, that is when women finally got a drug for female sexual dysfunction. It's a 17-year gap from when men got a drug to when women got a drug for the very same condition, even though these conditions affect the male body and the female body a little bit differently, of course, but it's still the same condition, and it's it just was not prioritized for women's health, and so many other things are not prioritized when it comes to women's health as well.
Our lack of research is astounding at this point. Like in the age of information, ignorance is a choice, but we try to find things out. Like in researching and I've had macro doses and micro doses for years, but I had no idea that it had a different interpretation for the genders. You're the leading expert in the West so far on this topic. I was so happy to find someone that wrote something about it. And when I clicked it to research you, it was you. I'm like, okay, this is the latest expert. So like, in your opinion, menstrual cycle, menopause, chronic conditions relating to female at birth, can women hack their sexual health, their menstrual health, transitioning through menopause more easily using psilocybin?
I believe so. I mean, of course, we need more research on all of these topics, but we also can draw on Indigenous wisdom because, Indigenous communities have had this, strong history of using psilocybin for thousands of years. And so we have this, we think of science as this process of doing something over and over again to reproduce the same results. But we also have, that's exactly what Indigenous communities have been doing. And so we can pull that in as we're looking at science as well. And so, in terms of the menstrual cycle, I do think that psilocybin can really support the menstrual cycle. We need more research, but we do have some research that's in its in its beginnings, and that's coming out of Johns Hopkins Center for Psychedelic Research, or whatever it's called. I always forget the full name, but there's two women who have started to study psilocybin and the menstrual cycle, or just psychedelics in general with the menstrual cycle, and they've done some case studies and anecdotal reports on this. And what they're learning is that there might be, I wanted to mention the female scientists. They are Dr. Natalie Gukassian and Dr. Sasha K. Narayan. I just always like to give credit when people are doing amazing things, especially women. And so they've done these case studies and anecdotal reports. And what we're learning is that psilocybin potentially may make your cycle, like your menstrual cycle or your period, come a little earlier than you anticipated. So if you do a macro dose, that may happen. It may also bring back a menstrual cycle if we've had like a time where it's been absent, and that can happen for many reasons, such as stress or weight loss. I'm not speaking about in menopause. I'm talking about in those reproductive years. And then it may return and bring back regularity if someone's had some irregularity from their menstrual cycle. So from conditions like premenstrual dysphoric disorder, polycystic ovary syndrome, all of these things can cause a little bit of a disruption and irregularities. And so it's likely that psilocybin may help with re-regulation, which these three things are really promising, or they sound really promising. And so again, we need more research on that, but I'm excited to see that that's in the works. And so I do think psilocybin can really support the menstrual cycle and support us when we're dealing with some of these really difficult conditions that we aren't getting adequate treatment for in the mainstream medical system, of course. And everyone wants to know the mechanism of this, and I like to geek out over it. So like, why would taking magic mushrooms potentially do something with the menstrual cycle? Like no one really thought about this, right, until most recently. But what the mechanism is that so our menstrual cycles occur along what's called the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis. So meaning that our brains are communicating with our ovaries, and when one hormone kicks off, it essentially tells another hormone what to do in a feedback loop. And this is why we have our follicular phase, then ovulation, and then the luteal phase, and then we get our periods, right? And we, at the same time, we have another axis in our bodies called the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. And this axis is really concerned with our stress response. And when we use psilocybin, we're activating our serotonin receptors along that axis. And so you can tell by their names that these axes overlap with the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. So mainly in the brain, they overlap. And so we know from just general life, if we're not even talking about psilocybin, we know that stress can impact our menstrual cycles, right? And, we might not stop having a cycle temporarily. Or when we are on our periods or leading up to them, we can get more stressed, right? We've all,
Right.
as women, have all experienced that. So we know these axes overlap and one affects the other. And so it's not a stretch to assume that a psilocybin journey would likely impact your menstrual cycle and vice versa, that the menstrual cycle may impact your journey, depending on where you are in your cycle. So again, we need more research on all of this to sort of gain some better strategies for it. But as I mentioned, I like to bring in Indigenous wisdom. And so I did talk to a woman. Her name is Michaela De La Maico. She's amazing. She's on Instagram as Mama De La Maico. And I interviewed her about sort of Indigenous practices. And she also practices womb care with plant medicine. So she helps people support their menstrual cycles with plant medicine, which I love that she's doing that. But she mentioned that it's probably like a good strategy to use psilocybin closer to ovulation rather than when you're getting closer to your menstrual cycle. And that has to do with the energy that's sort of available in our bodies. And so as we get closer to our periods, we can have a lot of energy depletion, and a psilocybin journey can also be very energy depleting. Whereas when you're closer to ovulation, you have more energy available. When we're closer to, I guess, when we get into our luteal phase, so when I'm talking about energy available in the body, what I'm really talking about is, at least from my perspective, is the glucose metabolism and how insulin and glucose interplay with each other. And so when we're closer to our periods, we become more insulin resistant because all of our energy supplies are kind of being shuttled to the womb for the potential growth of a baby, right? But if you're near ovulation, you have much more stable. You have a more stable glucose metabolism response rather than when you're closer to your period. And then a lot of people also will fast before a journey, just to kind of perhaps enhance it. And that might mean fasting just for a few hours or fasting the day of, or even in the days leading up to your journey. People have different practices associated with that. But it's much more difficult to fast when you're getting closer to your period because that's when we have cravings, and all of this is related to that insulin resistance that's kind of exacerbated in that luteal phase. So I find this really fascinating, and I was really excited to kind of gain a strategy in terms of, try to aim for closer to ovulation. And Indigenous communities typically don't allow someone to journey when they're on their period anyway. So like if you were to do a ceremony, if you travel to do a ceremony and you're working with an Indigenous practitioner, they will not allow a woman who's on her period to actually do the journey. And I think it's really important to respect that because it's there for that practice is there for a reason. And then when it comes to microdosing for your cycle, Michaela De La Maico mentioned to pick whatever protocol you're going to do. There's several different microdosing protocols out there, and follow that protocol for 3 months, which would be over the course of 3 cycles, and track your symptoms. If it's perhaps changing symptoms related to your menstrual cycle, and that will give you an idea if this protocol is the right one for you, or if you want to switch protocols or stop microdosing altogether. It's just will depend on your own experience. But I loved that strategy as well, simply because yes, you'll have a track. You'll track it, and you'll be able to look and see. So that's my spiel on the menstrual cycle. But I'm happy to talk about other things like menopause and sexual function as well.
This should be shared. Thank you for being kind of that bridge at the moment.
You're welcome.
You did mention a bit about obviously like with serotonin, a lot of people, not just women, but a lot of people are on SSRIs for depression, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. And through friends and talking to friends and researching a bit over time, that can disrupt your menstrual cycle. What do you think the versus advantage, disadvantage of between SSRIs and actually having microdoses of psilocybin would be?
Yeah, so I do talk about this, and I think it's really important to discuss. So I there's nothing wrong with SSRIs. Like I think they're great medications and they help many people. And I certainly don't want to encourage anyone to go off of an SSRI without working with their doctor to safely do that, if it's even safe for them
Yes,
to do that. So I always like to preface this talk before.
absolutely.
But yeah, I do have concerns about like how many people are on SSRIs and how it's just kind of like this band-aid that a doctor will throw at you if you, especially for women who are in perimenopause, who go in, they've never really battled depression before, but then they go to their doctor and they, because they're in perimenopause and are starting to have more depressive symptoms. And then rather than like offering any other solutions, a doctor might just be like, here's an SSRI, take this, and this can have a lot of ramifications for our health as well. So SSRIs, they blunt your mood, right? That's how they work, and
Right.
that's their benefit, right? But not only do they blunt your lows, which is what most people are going for, they're also going to blunt your highs, and I have a real concern with that because then you're not leaning into your joys as much and really feeling life. What we've learned about psilocybin through research is that instead of making us feel blunted like an SSRI, psilocybin actually makes you feel more okay with your highs and lows, which is a really cool thing to just sort of lean into our feelings and be okay with our feelings. Now, this might not be the solution for everyone, psilocybin, but it might work for many people. And what we've learned from research as well is that with psilocybin, using it for major depression, that if you do a macro dose, it can be very lasting. So we're still learning the length of that lasting, but it could be up to a year. We've seen that, we've seen different things in different clinical trials where it's like 6 months or a year. So you may be able to macro dose, once a year, once every 6 months, once a quarter or something like that. And then in between that, do some micro dosing to help support your macro doses or kind of like keep tapping back into those experiences. Whereas if we think about an SSRI, you have to take that every day for it to work. Getting off of an SSRI can be really difficult because you get so many side effects from going off. Even if you're weaning slowly, it can be a challenge. And, we have to think about the fact that when you're taking something every day, that can cause side effects as well. And a main side effect of many SSRIs is low libido. And now, if we tie this back to menopause or perimenopause, another symptom of that, of perimenopause, can be having a low libido. So, and that can mean many things, but so we could be taking an SSRI to help with depression, but then exacerbating another symptom related to menopause. Obviously, depression can happen outside of perimenopause as well, and so I do have a concern with doctors just throwing SSRIs at people if we aren't trying other things. And someone recently asked me in an interview, like, doctors are all worried that people will just turn to psilocybin instead of going through all these other, methods. And I'm like, well, what's wrong with that?
That's
Because
okay.
we've shown it's relatively safe
Wrong.
with certain contexts, and that it's not addictive at all. So you don't have to take it regularly. You can as a microdose, but you're still not going to become addicted to it. Whereas you do with it, I mean, that is totally what you become with an SSRI, is you become addicted to it. Because if you've ever missed a dose of your SSRI, when I was previously on SSRIs, you start to feel a little like, what, you feel a little
Right.
off. So yeah, so I have some real issues with that. And then psilocybin, in terms of, I mentioned that SSRIs can blunt your sexual function or your sexual desire and your libido essentially. Can psilocybin help with sex life? Yeah, potentially. I mean, I don't think it's a classic aphrodisiac like we think of something like chocolate or oysters or something like that, but it can do a couple of things. So there's two things that are relatively protective against female sexual dysfunction. And these aren't guarantees that you won't have female sexual dysfunction, just things that can help
Yeah.
either prevent it or help kind of change the scenario for you. And these two are having a positive body image, and then also having good intimate partner communication, with your sexual partner. And psilocybin does seem to facilitate both of those things. We know through research that psilocybin is helping with body image with clinical trials for eating disorders. We're seeing some really good results for clinical trials with psilocybin for anorexia nervosa. And so that can happen in the brain is getting some rigidity in a part of the brain called the angular gyrus. And that's pretty characteristic of eating disorders. And it looks like psilocybin kind of reduces some of that rigidity there, can help lessen some of the factors that contribute to an eating disorder, including improving, it can help improve body image. So there's that. And then also we do see that psilocybin can facilitate intimate partner communication. And it doesn't mean that you have to do psilocybin with your partner. You can go off and do a journey on your own, and then come back and feel more connected to your partner. And there's tons of science behind that. And I think it's such a magical thing, because who would have thought that, like, why wouldn't it have to be that you would be with your partner, but you can be apart, and that, because not everyone wants to do psilocybin. So what if you're with someone who doesn't? So these two things could be potentially protective against female sexual dysfunction and help lessen the impact if that is something that is a factor for you.
Well, that's so great that you say that. And when you were speaking there about what affects it, can you describe a little bit about the so BDNF?
So psilocybin actually binds to your serotonin receptors and activates them. And then that can cause some different things going on, including an increase of, I think it's called glutamate, which is an excitatory, neurotransmitter. And then it also likely increases the expression of brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is BDNF. I always mess up that acronym. But what these things do is, BDNF is really related to some of our neuroplasticity that happens. Right. So growing synapses and dendrites in the brain, and sort of a little bit of brain remodeling in a good way, and so that can increase that expression of that. And I just always like to describe it. It's almost like if you were to look at a flower and you see it starting to, or like a bud, and you see it start to bloom. That's what BDNF does. And so that can have some pretty profound effects on our cognitive function, of course, but also if we're trying to make some type of behavior change, this would be beneficial for that. So something like if we are trying to, quit drinking wine, or quit online shopping, or quit drinking wine and online
behaviors. Yeah.
Right? Those sorts of things. It's a really great way to lean into behavior change, is when we have this increased neuroplasticity after using psilocybin. But it can also be beneficial for our mood, which can support sexual function, all of these things, including supporting your body image, all of that. So it's really beneficial that way.
Well, that's really great kind of lead in, because with addictive behaviors, a lot of people are turning to psilocybin to just kind of restructure their neuroplasticity and stop doing one thing that they're so entangled to doing because of just practice. But one thing that, a lot of people are using at parties now is like, I want to have, just in between a microdose and a little bit more than that, as a social drug. So do you and drug is I call it plant medicine, but do you think that psilocybin is the social drug of 2024 moving forward?
I think it can aid in some social aspects. So what you're talking about is doing what's called a museum dose, which I just love the name of it. So we're thinking in terms of like dosages, like a microdose is about 1/10 of a gram. Right. A museum dose could be anywhere from 0.5 to 1.5 of a gram. And then a macrodose is really above that. So we're looking at, 2 to 3.5. 4 grams would be a macro dose. We have also what's called a heroic dose, which is more above 5 grams, which I don't recommend anyone start with. If you want to start low and go slow, ease into it. But yeah, so the museum dose, I do hear of a lot of people using that in a social setting, but I do caution people, like if you've never tried psilocybin before and then you just go and do a museum dose, it might be a little discombobulating, because depending on where you're at, but like if you were like at a rave or something, it might be very overstimulating to you and cause some anxiety and things that might crop up. So I just caution people about that. And, I like to think of macro doses as something that we do a little bit more therapeutically, where you're kind of, you don't have to be alone, but you're not like necessarily out out and about, because again, that
Yeah.
could exacerbate a negative experience and stuff. But yeah, there's some element of, being in public with a museum dose or just a little bit higher than a macrodose, I mean, a microdose. And then, a little higher than a microdose. And just really, you feel really relaxed and, but not so relaxed that you're not, I don't want to talk to anybody, though that can happen. It really just depends on if you're more of introvert or extrovert. And so, but yeah, it could be something that is really fun to do after you've gained a little experience with psilocybin, I would say.
Right. And in saying that, I mean, I loved, listening to you in other podcasts, the way you spoke of your mother, and I really loved that she was your hero. One thing I wanted to ask, like my parents, they don't understand magic mushrooms and the thought of that. They're still in that, like, you'll poke your eye out, you'll jump off a balcony. Like,
right.
Like, what would you say to women or anyone really that is, here's, I have a depression. I want to get off SSRIs. I want to end some addictive behavior, but there's still that, that predisposition to what we used to think about psychedelics. What would you say to them to kind of help them just gain a little bit more confidence in how this medicine can be used for their benefit?
Of course. Yeah, I would say read my book,
Right.
but also, I think be aware that the war on drugs, which really started with the Nixon administration and perpetuated through the Reagan administration and a little bit beyond that, there was a lot of misinformation put out about psychedelics. And so that's why we have a lot of these classic concepts of, oh yeah, you'll jump out a window or whatever, or you'll lose your mind forever, or you'll just be tripping your whole life after you try something like acid or whatever. And so, I always, my focus is really on psilocybin. I'm not well versed in all the other psychedelics, but I think when you look at the toxicity of drugs, if you were looking at the toxicity of different substances, psilocybin is actually the least toxic, whereas alcohol is one of the most toxic. But look how we look at the alcohol as just part of our society, right? And we have this stigma around psilocybin, yet psilocybin is way less toxic than alcohol. It's also way less toxic than the Tylenol you have in your medicine cabinet. So you can die from taking too much Tylenol. You're not going to die from taking too much psilocybin. I mean, I've done the research on, like, have we ever had deaths from psilocybin? And there's 2 instances where psilocybin was linked to deaths, but it was in people who had heart conditions. One even had a heart transplant, and then the other person had, I don't know the specifics of their heart condition, but I don't know that it was officially determined that was the reason that this person died was psilocybin. So, over the course of history of these people using psilocybin, these are the only 2 reports that we have of instances actually linked to where a death is linked to psilocybin. We have lots of deaths linked to overdoses of Tylenol because that can cause liver damage. Same thing with, alcohol deaths, things like that, opioid deaths, all of that. And so again, I just bringing this back to, like, we've stigmatized substances that can be relatively safe for you, but then we've, like, amplified and normalized certain substances that are really toxic for you. And so just keep that in mind. And then just know that there's so much research coming out now that is supporting this idea of therapeutic benefits of psilocybin plus MDMA. And we're really close with MDMA getting FDA approval for psychedelic assisted therapy on that. We're super close. And then I think that with psilocybin, that will follow really close behind. And I think once we have that FDA approval for both, not that I'm married to the government having to sign off on things, but I think once we do have that FDA approval for both psilocybin and MDMA, we will have a greater reduction in that stigma, and it will help, push people to maybe try it, or, like, give them the motivation then to go ahead and try it, which is nice to know. But yeah, like, we're further along with clinical trials on MDMA, but I think that will help. And we just have to kind of put away anything we learned during the war on drugs, because most of that's not true.
Absolutely. And I'm Australian as well as Canadian, and in Australian news, they've just done the trials. The equivalent of FDA approval is now out for Australia with MDMA and psilocybin, only for certified practitioners. anything that's getting its way there is great. But I wondered what your take on the corporate integration of that might be, with when it becomes something that you can't patent nature, right? But what do you think about how it could look if, pharmaceuticals are there creating dependencies sometimes, but these things don't? Like, where do you see the future of microdosing or using plant medicine as a medicine?
Yeah, I think it's going to follow a little bit like we've seen with cannabis. And I only have the US to go on here,
Right,
but
right,
we've seen where like cannabis has either become available for medicinal use or
right,
recreational use. And we've got dispensaries kind of all over the US. And there's still some states like my state, Tennessee, that doesn't allow any cannabis use
right.
except for hemp derived. But I won't get into all the specifics on that. But so we've got a patchwork of states have legalized in some way or decriminalized in some way. And I think that will happen, with psilocybin, which is good. And then, but I do worry about some of the issues that can develop because once we get into FDA approval, then we've got corporations that are really capitalizing on this
That's
sacred
right.
substance, which is a little skeevy in my mind. I understand that we're going to have access issues, and so we will need like corporations maybe producing things or whatever. I don't know, but it is a little weird that when you think about where these substances originated from, I mean, especially psilocybin being a very sacred substance in indigenous communities, to then a bunch of white bros
Yeah.
mostly capitalizing on it and making money off of it. That kind of weirds me out a little bit. I have to be honest. It's part of I guess just what will happen. But another big concern is that when we look at the cannabis industry, we think about how many Black and brown people were incarcerated for cannabis offenses,
Right.
and then now the cannabis industry is like largely white, just
Money
because
off
like now
it.
it's legal, right? And so yeah, and that's frustrating. And I think we will see a similar whitewashing with psychedelics, which I don't like that at all, so it's always my goal is to try to work with, an Indigenous practitioner if I can, support Indigenous communities or Indigenous practitioners that are doing facilitation of psilocybin retreats and things like that. I think that's a really great way to just sort of try to keep money going to people who really deserve that.
Agreed. I believe that, and definitely am on that with you. One of my last questions, you spoke of the entourage effect. I have no idea what this is. Can you describe what that is?
Yes. I just imagine like your squad of people walking
Yeah.
in with you. It's your entourage, right? No. So
Everyone's
the
got
entourage.
mushrooms.
Right, exactly. Your entourage effect, or the entourage effect in cannabis, is probably the easiest way to explain it. Is so we have, not, and I'll relate this back to psilocybin, but in cannabis we talk about two different compounds there are main compounds. We've got CBD and THC as two main compounds that are in cannabis, and so what we've kind of learned is that these work really well together, creating a better effect. Like CBD might lessen some of the paranoia that goes with THC and things
Right.
like that. So they have a beneficial effect, and we're still learning about that, and deciding if that's actually true or not. But what we're thinking with psilocybin is that we may have a similar effect with female hormones. So maybe your hormone trajectory within your menstrual cycle, like where you are in your cycle, may produce a really good entourage effect with psilocybin. So we don't know how that looks yet. Is it that like if your estrogen is high or if it's low, when is that like in that hormonal roller coaster that we have, is that the better time to do a psilocybin journey? We're still learning that. But there's possibly this entourage effect with female hormones. And then we may have entourage effects related to like which strains we're doing. So we may learn in the future through additional research that doing this strain with this strain, like, combining to make a dose would produce a more beneficial effect or a better journey. Again, we need to figure that all out. But I just love that, we could really get geeky about this and create some really cool strategies, or determine that this strain and that strain are great for if you are, wanting to focus on this one thing or, support your hormones in this way. It could be really cool once we dig it further into the research.
I look forward to your geek out research on that. That would be super fascinating. It help a lot of people, a lot of women, and a lot of people. Just a couple more questions. I would love to know, what do you wish more people knew about what you did?
About what I do?
Out there that you're like, I just wish people knew X about what you do, because it is such a niche, such a unresearched area.
Yeah, I think what I would love to share is it's not necessarily something like about what I do, but I think really about like how psychedelics work. So in our brains, like why do they produce a beneficial effect for anxiety, trauma, things like that? And so I'll just briefly explain this concept that researchers have come up with. It's called the Rebus model, and it stands for Relaxed Beliefs Under Psychedelics. And so this model was created by Dr. Robin Carhart Harris and Dr. Carl J. Friston. And they use it to just really describe like why does it work? And so essentially in when we're young, we have really flexible brains, meaning we haven't formulated our ideas about ourselves or how the world around us operates. It's just because we haven't solidified our identities when we're like 4, right? And then over time, of course, we do start to solidify that. It's still always changing. Our identity is always changing, but it can become, by the time we're in adulthood, as opposed to having this really flexible brain, we tend to have a much more rigid brain, meaning that, it can be really hard to change your mind about yourself or how the world around you operates, and especially if you've got negative beliefs. And so if we were to think of being in a normal state of consciousness as an adult, our brain is like a frozen pond. It's super rigid. If you were to try to take a new belief in the form of a rock, drop it on that pond, it just goes thunk. It doesn't really gain any entry, right? Now, if you're on a psychedelic, this is where the relaxed beliefs under psychedelics comes in. It's like you've got this thawed pond. Now, if we take that rock and drop it into the pond, it gains entry and it causes a ripple effect, and especially in the form of like increased neuroplasticity. But this happens because our belief systems sort of form this hierarchy in our brain. So like in a normal state of consciousness, we can think of this hierarchy in our brain where we've almost like a corporation. And so you've got your CEO beliefs at the top, sort of controlling everything, and they don't want to listen to the lesser employees or beliefs that are, maybe trying to climb up the ladder, right? And so they're like, we don't listen to you. And so that's why it's really hard to change your mind about something, especially if you have a negative belief. But when you're on a psychedelic, that hierarchy kind of goes away. And like the employees that are lower on the ladder, those beliefs, they can really kind of climb into your brain and take over in a better way, And so it reduces that hierarchy of beliefs that just really becomes so rigid. And so that's why we're seeing so many great benefits in terms of, changing negative beliefs about ourselves, and then also reducing some of that the triggers that we have related to trauma. There's another concept that I'll just briefly explain as well, and that's called the helioscope effect. And the helioscope effect was created by Dr. Gregor Hassler, I believe. And so in science, unrelated to psychedelics, scientists use a helioscope to look at the sun because you don't want to look directly at the sun or you'll burn your eyes, right? And it's the same way that we feel about our trauma in a normal state of consciousness. If we've had trauma, we kind of avoid thinking about it or looking at it or even, just kind of dwelling on it because we're like, that's so triggering. It creates anxiety for us. When we're on a psychedelic, though, it's like we have this helioscope to look at our traumas through a safe like a filter and a safe lens to view it without getting burned by our trauma, which is really great because then you can look at it and typically see it in a new way and reprocess it so that when you're no longer on the psychedelic, that we don't have those same triggers, or the triggers, we can kind of change those, that we can lessen the triggering effects of our traumas. And so that is why it can really be beneficial for something like PTSD, really just any form of trauma, potentially with anxiety and fear related to those traumas. And so I'm really excited about those models, and I'm really glad researchers came up with them because they're so useful in explaining why a psychedelic might work for someone.
I hadn't heard about the helioscopic, like that terminology, and it makes so much sense. I wonder if like Rebus helioscopic, is that related to where the default mode network can just dissolve the ego? Is that part of the ego dissolution that many people feel with psychedelics?
Yeah, I think that's all part of it. It's all just part of these brain changes that happen temporarily while you're on a
Right.
psychedelic. I mean, the only thing that
The
really
observer.
lasts after is the neuroplasticity. But yeah, it's just getting into the default mode network. So we have this network of brain regions that work together in our brain and they work together to sort of like create our ego. They're involved in our ego. They're really involved. The network is involved in our sense of self, our autobiographical info, so all of our memories, or if we're just letting our minds wander, it's highly active. But so there's some things that happen when you use psilocybin where certain parts of the default mode network that normally connect will disconnect, and other parts that don't normally connect will connect. So I always like to like sort of use this analogy of that outlet that you have in your house that you've got tons of cords plugged into it. It's like a power strip and everything. And if you were to take all those cords, unplug them and plug them in a different way, this is kind of what's happening when you're on a psychedelic. But something that can happen is something is called ego death or ego dissolution, or
Right.
there's even an acronym called drug induced ego dissolution. So DIED, which sounds really scary,
Great.
right? But it does. What happens is that essentially during a psychedelic journey, you often have a less focus. Yes, you're highly focused on like what's going on in your brain or whatever, but you're less zoomed in on you, and you become more like you can feel more connected to the
Observer.
universe at
Yeah.
large, or the people around you, the people that you know and love, and that sort of thing. And that can have some really beneficial effects for our anxiety, trauma, etc. Because I think in a normal state of consciousness, yes, we kind of know we have this support system out there, right? Your friends and family or whatever. But to really feel that in your body is something that can happen on a psychedelic. And there's a really cool term for it called oceanic boundlessness, which I just love, that connectivity. And so I think that can have some really like beneficial effects for people too, because it can be lasting. So,
That's
even though you experience that increased connection to the world, when you're on the psychedelic, when you leave, or when you're like done with your psychedelic, when you're off the drug or plant medicine, it still exists for you. Like that happened for me. Like I felt that strong oceanic boundlessness, and then returned to a normal state of consciousness. And even a year later, after doing my macrodose, I could feel that increased connectivity to everyone that I know and love, and it's been life changing for me. So it's amazing.
I'm with you 100%. And I know, like, once you get out of the oceanic boundlessness, you can still be away from the ocean, hundreds of miles away, but
Yeah.
it knows you and you know it, and you can't
Mhm.
close that door again, And I think that's,
Yeah.
so Jen, just before we finish up here, I'd love to just say when someone is so committed to truth and to understanding and to inner standing, um, and it takes such an incredible journalist like yourself to not just be curious about something, but like, I have to write this from the full experience. Like, I have to go deep, gotta take this fucking plant medicines. Oh my God, I'm going to do it. That's commitment that helps the world. So I just get myself
Thank
goosebumps
you.
talking about you. But I'd really love to encourage people, get your book, especially if
Thank
they
you.
don't know if they should take that journey yet. As someone that you didn't take the micro, or sorry, the medicine to heal a trauma necessarily. You were just, I'm the writer and I've got to get the full story. Like, you knew you wanted to be a
Yes.
writer when you were what, like in grade 5 or something?
Yeah. When I was in fifth grade. Yeah.
That's a purpose. And this show is people, passion, purpose, and you are an embodiment of that. So I really want to thank you for
Thank
your time and for being
you.
here. Lastly, especially because you're in the field of literature, do you have a favorite quote or a recommendation for a life-changing book that really helped you and you become who you are?
Yeah. I always keep meaning to look up who the poet is that said this. I think it might have been, oh gosh, I can't
All
think of
good.
which poet this is, but it is. So this quote was my guide, my psilocybin guide told me this quote before I went into my journey, and it really stuck with me, and I like to share it with people. But it is the love that you withhold is the pain that you carry. And so I'll just say it again. The love that you withhold is the pain that you carry. And this really
Oh,
resonated with me because it's so true. Like sometimes even though we are close to our friends and family and whatnot, we may put up a wall. And I've guilty. I'm guilty. And so, to using psilocybin like really helped reduce that wall for me. And, it really showed me that why I was putting up walls was because I have pain related to certain relationships in my life that I've had and that have traumatized me. And, but I don't need to do that with the people that I'm really safe with. I can take those walls down. And that has been really life changing going forward. So the love that you withhold is the pain that you
You
carry.
can feel that. I felt that. That's interesting. I pictured like a backpack of pain, just like you don't have to carry this up the hill,
Yeah. Throw
go
it
it
down.
forward.
Yes.
Oh, that's awesome.
Absolutely.
Jen, thank you so much. Thank you for being on Power Perspectives. I greatly appreciate your time. Where you can find Jennifer, she is a fact checker extraordinaire, and it's so great to follow someone like that because they save you a lot of time and effort and not knowing whether what you're reading is actually been fact checked. So you can find Jennifer at jenniferchesak.com or on social media handle on Instagram at Jen Chesak. It's Chesak. Jen, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure as well.
I'm Shannon, and until next time, may we embrace the most powerful gift we possess, our ability to change and evolve our perspective.